For a start, the AFP, via an operation known as Operation Mocha, were actually in the process of investigating the very thing which Schapelle Corby's lawyer was suggesting.
Former head of Australian Federal Police anti-organised crime operations, Ray Cooper, revealed that it was well known amongst his colleagues that unwitting passengers were regularly used as mules to traffic narcotics. Police were linked to those operations. There were narcotics, particularly cannabis, being moved from airport to airport by syndicates, and the baggage handlers were playing a key role in it. These dates, investigators revealed of the Operation Mocha drug bust, were based on the work rosters of the corrupt baggage handlers at Sydney Airport. That very exact same day, Schapelle Corby flew from Brisbane to Sydney, then on to Bali. 4.2 kilograms of cannabis were discovered in her boogie-board bag at Ngurah Airport, Bali.
The head of the baggage handler Mocha operation was later arrested for conspiring to import $160 million of precursor drugs into Australia. So we also appear to have corrupt police on the scene, another development for which the parameters and boundaries were unknown.
Now the arrest of a top Australian drug investigator. Mark Standen was arrested at his desk over a conspiracy to produce $120 million worth of the drug ice.
Huge amounts of money, huge amounts of drugs.
I've been told repeatedly since the mid-1970s, began with the Stewart Royal Commission and other Royal Commissions, that the Narcotics Bureau of that time had permeated mainstream policing and the federal police. But this is a two-pronged problem. It's one about the State Crime Commission, but it's also a problem about the Australian Federal Police.
Why has this been able to happen without the public knowing?
Well, you'd have to ask your media colleagues that, because there's been no shortage of attempts to let the media know. There's been no shortage of information.
This was one of the biggest drug-related operations in the history of Australian policing, and Mr. Keelty was well aware of it when he made that statement. He must also have been aware that the full parameters and boundaries of the airport drug syndication ring were unknown. So even at this level, his statement surely verges on the ridiculous from an operational perspective. Not only were the police actually investigating baggage handler corruption, but exactly the same thing had previously happened to others.
Corby's defence team claimed there were baggage handlers at both Sydney and Brisbane airports smuggling drugs. But the federal police completely dismissed the accusations. Then came the bombshell. The same thing had happened before. But this Melbourne couple were lucky enough not to be searched by Indonesian customs. In June 1997, 8 years ago, Dee and Steve were unpacking after their flight to Bali when they were stunned to find a large block of compressed marijuana in their luggage.
When we got to the motel room, my wife opened up the case, yelled out my name. I turned around and she had a package of marijuana in her hands, probably similar to the size of a loaf of bread.
Just a big plastic bag, and it was all quite firm and packed.
The Melbourne couple reported their find to an Australian consulate official in Bali, and his response left them stunned.
Give him the bad news. He goes, well, you get caught with that, mate, and you'll be eating nosy goring for the rest of your life in jail. And he suggested that I just flush it down the toilet, flush the whole lot down the toilet, get it out of my possession, and don't go to the authorities under any circumstances at all.
And their call was confirmed by the Australian consulate last week, after their story became public.
And more.
Alan Kessing never wanted to speak out about anything. until he wrote a report damning the security at Sydney Airport. When the report was leaked, the damage went all the way to the top.
Alan Kessing, bag packed, ready to go to jail for leaking a confidential report about slack security at Sydney Airport.
It all began when, as a top customs investigator, he was selected to research dangerous holes in security at Sydney's airports. But 2 years later, when Kessing's confidential reports were leaked to the media, he was charged and tried. Found guilty of whistleblowing, Kessing was convicted under the notorious Commonwealth Crimes Act. Drafted in the overwrought era at the start of World War I to prevent the release of secret information, the Crimes Act still operates in the same way today.
What we were proposing by pointing out all the failings, that it was going to cost the airlines and, more to the point, the privatised airport corporation big bucks to rectify. Now, the point about it is that the rectifications would merely have brought them in line with the requirements of the Customs Act, but nonetheless they were rejected purely for commercial reasons, and we were told that straight out. When I first heard of my reports being leaked 2.5 years after I wrote them, my first thought was, I think that was 31st of May, and unfortunately Schapelle would have been convicted on the 27th of May of 2005. My first thought was, somebody obviously had this story. Why didn't they publish the story whilst the trial was still going on? And it is well known. They use it, the corrupted personnel behind the lines in the baggage handling or wherever are using the domestic airports to smuggle drugs between the state capitals, for instance. That, yes. It's always been from the very bottom, from the cleaners, the guys who push around mops and buckets, right up to the top, whether it's the commercial side, such as the airline staff themselves, or even some customs officers, I mean, or quarantine for that matter. But when I came back on duty in 2005, and when Schapelle Corby was on trial, and those officers who hadn't already resigned were absolutely consumed with anger. There's no other word for it, sheer fury, that reports that were submitted to point out exactly these vulnerabilities had now resulted in this, which we've warned against over and over and over. It's just a disgrace from beginning to end, the fact that this information was well known to customs officers and AFP for years, as is demonstrated by the occasional busts reported in the media in the late part of 2004 and the early part of 2005, showing imports of drugs using corrupt handlers or corrupt staff at the airport, and yet you can make a statement like that when somebody's life was in the balance over in Bali. It's just outrageous. If the Australian authorities had acknowledged to the Balinese court that there was significant doubt about the case, if they had simply admitted that the airport was full of holes, that baggage handlers were notoriously corrupt, as had been shown time and again in the previous months and even the previous year of drug importations using corrupt handlers, it must have cast massive doubt on any absurd notion that she was guilty. It could not have possibly have sustained a conviction with this knowledge. But the really awful thing about it is that if my reports had been acted upon when they were written 2 years previously, this situation should never have arisen. But the mere fact that these reports were suppressed for the worst of reasons, the cost to commercial entities, and somebody is paying for it basically with their their life and their sanity now is an absolute outrage.
And more.
Gary Lee Rogers was a police officer who became a high-profile whistleblower when he alleged drug running at Sydney Airport and corruption within the AFP. He predicted that he would be murdered because of what he had discovered.
Gary Lee Rogers, Assistant Inspector for Australian Protective Services, which was responsible for airport security until 2002, was assaulted by his work colleagues after blowing the whistle on Sydney Airport corruption. "I am in fear of my life," Lee Rogers wrote to Whistleblowers Australia. "Today, at 1400 hours, I received an anonymous phone call," Gary Lee Rogers continued, saying that I had tripped over evidence of drug importation through Sydney Airport involving the old Commonwealth Police network.
He sought a meeting with the Attorney General regarding his discoveries, but before this could be arranged, he was found dead.
On October 1st, 2002, Gary Lee Rogers was found dead in his flat with a blood-stained knife, bloody pillow and 2 white plastic bottles in his right hand.
To the shock of his family, campaigners and observers, the coroner decided that this was death by natural causes. The coroner also placed what have been called a gagging order upon proceedings and witnesses. Whistleblowers Australia sent some information to Schapelle Corby's lawyers, who complained repeatedly that the AFP were refusing to cooperate and were engaged in a cover-up. Whistleblowers Australia directly referred to Commissioner Kelty's apparent hostility. Even to this day, campaigners cite this case has been an unprecedented cover-up of police corruption and airport drug syndication. Then there are the Ray Cooper revelations.
Former head of Australian Federal Police anti-organised crime operations, Ray Cooper, revealed that it was well known amongst his colleagues that unwitting passengers were regularly used as mules to traffic narcotics. Police were linked to those operations. There were narcotics, particularly cannabis, being moved from airport to airport by syndicates, and the baggage handlers were playing a key role in it.
Ray Cooper, former head of the operations of the AFP internal investigations, revealed that it was well known by the AFP that unwitting passengers were being used as drug mules to shift drugs between airports. He also revealed that his investigation suggested that some federal police officers were in league with the smugglers. These are not isolated cases. There is also a long history of airport baggage handler drug syndication and AFP corruption.
Wayne Sievers was a member of the unit at the time.
You had theft of drugs, you had people running with criminals, you had prosecutions that were compromised, you had a range of corrupt activities.
The most recent allegations of systemic corruption came from former federal detective Alan Tashak, who claims a long-standing cell of corrupt federal detectives has been ignored.
He began an inquiry only to have it shut down and handed over to the Sydney office where corruption was endemic.
Is to discredit the informants and cover up the AFP's activities in Sydney.
Many observers believe that the government's political motive was not only to avoid international difficulty with Indonesia, but also to avoid scrutiny of the AFP and airport corruption, with its inevitable domestic political fallout.